Welcome to our video on the fascinating history of Egypt, folks. In this video, we will delve into the rich and complex history of one of the world's oldest civilizations. From the significance of the Nile River to the cultural and political achievements of the three main periods of Egyptian history, we will explore the various scientific and technological advancements made by the Egyptians during the Pharaonic dynasty, as well as the factors that contributed to Egypt's decline during the era of the priests of the god Amon. We will also examine how the introduction of Islam affected Egypt's development and culture, and how the construction of the Suez Canal impacted the country's economy and relations with other countries. Finally, we will discuss the impact of World War II and the nationalization of the Suez Canal on Egypt's relationship with other nations. Join us on this exciting journey through the history of Egypt. Despite the fact that in ancient times there were dozens of state formations on the planet, ancient Egypt is considered the main one. Not surprising, given the number of wonders of the world and the truly mighty achievements of the Egyptians, some of which are more than 9,000 years old. Recently we decided to start a new rubric, and now we are going to try to squeeze all the history of Egypt into 10 minutes. It is not an easy task, and we need your help. Please tell us in the comments if you would like to do this column, and if you have any comments or suggestions for the countries that we will release next. Well, in the meantime, we'll get started and move away from the history books. They divide the history of Egypt into dozens of periods, sprinkle in dates, and accentuate events that are not particularly interesting in the context of history. We will divide our video, and therefore the history of Egypt, into three parts: ancient, Greco-Roman, and Arab history, which lasts to this day. Details and specifics are, of course, great, but our goal is to introduce you to the truly important things in the country's life. We will gather details and interesting facts about each stage in the description. So let's start with a brief introduction and go back not just 1,000, but tens of thousands of years. Africa was different then. It was once a tropical rainforest where human civilization was born. Later, Africa in general, as well as Egypt in particular, became dry land and the area became savanna. There is little trace of ancient humans in the country, but scientists suggest that Homo sapiens appeared in these territories as Egypt was an ideal site for migration from East Africa to Asia. They were black, but about 10,000 years ago they were displaced by a Semitic people, whose origins scientists are still battling over. And they settled in Egypt because of the incredible fertility of the Nile River. In fact, ancient people called Egypt the gift of the Nile. The fact is that tens of thousands of years ago, there was a bay of the Mediterranean Sea on the territory of modern northern Egypt. Later it became dry land, and at the same time a place that was flooded by the Nile, coming out of its banks. Numerous rains caused crazy floods, which were a gift from the gods. For the Nile made the soil fertile, and the water helped to grow anything on it. When the Nile returned to its banks, the ancient Egyptians would run out into its valley, sow its crops, and then eat them while the scorching sun scorched the soil, making it unfit for farming. But only until the next time the Nile broke its banks, after which the situation was repeated. In fact, that is why settlements appeared one after another in the Nile Valley. About 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, there were about 40 mini-states in the valley, and they all faced the same problem: a shortage of laborers. There were more and more people, and something had to be invented to keep feeding off the Nile. So the mini-states banded together and built dams, canals, reservoirs, and other agricultural structures. On the one hand, to keep the water of the spilled Nile longer, and on the other hand, to sow and repopulate more territories. In the 4th millennium BC, the process led to the formation of two giga-states, the Upper Nile and the Lower Nile. For some time, they opposed each other, but in the end, Upper Nile won. His pharaoh Narmer and his successor Menes gave birth to what historians call the dynastic period. This is the ancient Egypt that everyone is familiar with in general terms, with pharaohs, pyramids, and the conventional division into early, ancient, middle, and other kingdoms. This division is conditional, so we will not dwell on it. The life of pharaohs and builders of pyramids we have already analyzed in a separate video. Now let us focus on the main point. During the Pharaonic dynasty, Egypt was becoming a real state. The borders finally moved away from the Nile, albeit not significantly. There was an army that successfully defended Egypt against the nomads of Arabia, Ethiopia, and other countries. But most importantly, during this period, the Egyptians built truly mighty structures. And it's not just about the pyramids, although they are good. During the ancient kingdom, that is somewhere between 2700 and 2100 BC, the Egyptians mastered geometry, compiled a solar calendar, and even studied the stars. The Great Pyramids are a consequence of these scientific victories, but their construction would not have been possible without the skill of stoneworking and agricultural advances. The canal systems that the ancient Egyptians built aren't exactly losing out in efficiency to modern ones. And in parallel, the boys learned to bake bread, make beer, and fully learned how to write. And they even built the Suez Canal, which connected the Mediterranean and Red Seas. True, the climate got worse and the officials got greedier. This led to a couple of centuries of civil wars that returned Egypt to its old shattered state for a while. The Middle Kingdom was not far behind. Its boundaries are thought to be somewhere between 2100 and 1750 BC. Internal strife continued, but Egypt achieved something. The guys mastered bronze articles, started opening schools, and introduced the use of papyrus. They also mastered the creation of reservoirs. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty revived the parched Lake Moeris by turning it into an artificial water reservoir. Amenemhat III, through an elaborate system of canals, sluices, and dams, gave Egypt what it had needed for thousands of years. The artificial lake not only stored the water of the Nile, but also allowed the level of the river itself to be raised, thanks to advances in engineering. Just think about it. 4,000 years ago, the Egyptians quietly opened the tap and irrigated the necessary land. The capacity of the lake was enough for as many as 100 days. Here, the pharaoh built himself a pyramid and labyrinths, which the ancient Greeks considered the wonders of the world. Unfortunately, the period ended with almost the entire Nile Delta being overrun by Asian nomads. It was not until a couple of hundred years later that the history of the New Kingdom began. Sometime between 1500 and 1000 BC, Egypt rose from the ashes. During this period, the territory peaked. The boys learned how to build wells and mastered chariots. The Egyptians were giving the Persians and everyone around them a light. It was during this era that the famous Ramses II and Nefertiti lived. Temples were built, writing was perfected, and the education of children was given great attention. True, the construction of temples and killed the state. Priests of the god Amun plunged Egypt into chaos for 400 years. Pharaohs changed like gloves. Sometimes 5 pharaohs rule at the same time, and the church almost killed the state. And then the offended Persians, who actually conquered Egypt, joined the disco. Only by 600 BC, with the help of a hired Greek army, Pharaoh Psamtik managed to shake the established order of things. But still, by 525 BC, Egypt had become a full-fledged colony of Persia. This is an important date, for from that moment, ancient Egypt de facto ceased to exist. It was never independent again, but it was powerful. For Alexander the Great, in the year 332 BC, wrested Egypt from all and joined it to his empire. The wonders of the world were erected one by one. The Great Lighthouse, the Library of Alexandria, and the whole city of Alexandria made Egypt a major player on the international scene again, and also the main supplier of bread and, in fact, the planetary capital of science. True, they began to speak and write in Greek. The traditional script was slowly dying out. The last pharaoh of the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty you know very well is Cleopatra, who eventually married Julius Caesar and made Egypt part of the Roman Empire in the 30th year BC. This period lasts until 642, with the correction that in addition to Rome, the country had time to be part of the Byzantine Empire. The period was unremarkable. Egypt was stuck in development and turned from the center of the planet into a supplier of food. The Library of Alexandria was quietly looted and later blamed its destruction on the bad Arabs, who took the baton from the Romans and from 640 brought Islam to Egypt and assimilated the country much faster than the Greeks, in parallel filling up the Suez Canal and working on the degradation of science. In a couple of hundred years, the whole country spoke Arabic and even became purely Arabic in appearance. Spoiler, this is how Egypt remains to this day. In 870, the country would leave the Arab Caliphate and for almost 700 years on paper would be almost independent. The most notable figure here is Saladin, who fought the Crusaders and obscenely increased the territory of the Arab alliance. Unfortunately, apart from military achievements, there was not much else. Analyzing the climate, scientists conclude that the Egyptians of this era did not use the fertility of the soil, and the country was rather underpopulated than overpopulated. True, it is worth noting an important exception. Ahmad ibn Tulun, during whose reign the Egyptians mastered textiles and developed economically. Also in 972 was built Al-Azhar, the oldest operating university in the world. Well, in 1517, Egypt became part of the Ottoman Empire and became a typical colony. The situation is similar to Rome, only now the country fed the Turks and followed all their orders. Of interest, it is worth noting only Napoleon's unfortunate campaign in Egypt before the construction of the Suez Canal, which connected the Mediterranean and Red Seas. The Pharaohs dreamed of such canal, but in the end, in 1869, the French and the British finished building it, and later took away the rights to all the profits from the Egyptians. Spoiler: as a result of the many rebellions, Egypt would take ownership of the canal. And for a second, right now, the income from the canal is the second highest in the country, right after tourism. Around the same time, Egypt fell under the watchful eye of the British Empire, effectively losing its independence. In World War I, the Egyptian ruler tried to side with Germany, but was instantly overthrown, and the country effectively became a British colony. To the credit of the Egyptians with this fate, they fought so actively that only a few decades later, in 1936, the British granted Egypt full independence. True, the country continued to flounder. In World War II, there was a faction that wanted to support Germany, and it was just as swiftly put down. On paper, Egypt remained neutral and declared war only in 1945. But in fact, the British used the country as a staging post for their troops and an airbase. In many ways, dancing to Britain's tune led to the 1952 revolution. It also led to poverty, corruption, and fatigue of the sultans dragging the country into the abyss one after another. The result is Egypt in the give or take of the modern world. The country has a president, a truly independent policy and interests. The main one we have already mentioned is the Suez Canal. Because of its nationalization, Egypt's war with Britain, France, and Israel began in 1952. It is not difficult to guess that the poor people had no chance, but help came from where it was not expected. On the one hand, the U.S. pressured the Allies, not wanting wars to be fought without their permission. On the other hand, the Soviet Union saw in Egypt an excellent ally. Khrushchev even threatened England and France with thermonuclear strikes on their capitals. Under pressure from the two superpowers and the UN, the war was stopped. But Egypt is still cool and resentful of its enemies. But this is a story for political scientists, and we did our part. We hope you enjoyed our story of Egypt's history. If so, we'd love to see your likes and comments with your thoughts on similar rubrics. Until next time, folks.